Hello, everyone. Sam here, and we got to talk about The Monster Men by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is going to be a bit of an interesting episode because it's actually three episodes in one. Obviously, this is going to be a Buried by Burroughs episode, but it's also going to be a Rocket Summer 2026 episode because there's a significant science fiction element here. But this was the one I wasn't expecting. It's also going to be an entry to Jungle July because there's a significant element of a jungle adventure in the second half of this story. I didn't know about that element going into this story, but that apparently is the case. So, yeah, this will be a three episodes in one sort of deal. Now, to get to the Monster Men, this is actually kind of an interesting one in regards to its publication history. Because when this was first published, much like A Princess of Mars, it was not originally titled The Monster Men. As I mentioned in my Princess of Mars episode, when A Princess of Mars was first published in the pulp magazines, it was called Under the Moons of Mars, and it later became A Princess of Mars when it was published as a book. And that was the same instance with The Monster Men. It was originally published in November of 1913 in the pulp magazine All Story Magazine, and it was under the title of A Man Without a Soul. And according to most sources I looked up, it was significantly shorter than the final published book. So, remember, this was still fairly early in Burroughs' career. So, there were some earlier works that had significant changes done to the books when they went to print. And I actually have Michael Tierney's Edgar Rice Burroughs art chronology, so I think I can pull up the Man Without a Soul image. Yeah, here it is. A Man Without a Soul. As you can see, it was the front cover of All Story. Got Edgar Rice Burroughs' name very prominent. And you'll notice at the very bottom it says, A Story Like Tarzan. And that's very apropos. The second half of this story really does kind of feel Tarzan-esque. So that's pretty interesting. It's also a sign of how popular Tarzan was even by this early stage. Because I know I said in my first Buried by Burroughs episode, I was doing this roughly in order of when Burroughs' work was published in the pulp magazines. For the Monster Men, I skipped ahead two stories. The Gods of Mars and Return of Tarzan had started coming out before a Monster Men had. But I chose this one just because it was appropriate for the Rocket Summer event. So, like, when that pulp magazine says a story like Tarzan, remember that only two Tarzan stories had been released by that point. But Tarzan is still a huge figure, even by this point in his history. In regards to my edition, I have the Ace edition. And this one, the cover of this Ace edition is by an artist named Enric Torres. I haven't really heard of him before. And from what I understand, he was somewhat overshadowed with this edition because there were two other versions of this Ace edition, one by Frank Frazetta and another one by Boris Vallejo. So he was kind of working against two huge illustrative figures. But the funny thing is that I actually think Torres's cover is my favorite of these Ace editions for the Monster Men, just because I think it represents the horror vibes of the story a lot better than Frazetta's or Vallejo's does. Like, you have this monstrous face, you have the damsel in distress, you have these zombie and monster-like figures lurking in the background. I think it does a good job at capturing the vibe of the story. In fact, I think I actually have Tierney's art chronology. There should be... yeah, here we go. I can show you some of Frazetta's thing. That one in the top left corner, I know it's a lousy camera, but that's Frazetta's with the monster carrying the woman in red. This one that I've right here is with the tough guy posing in the three figures holding back. That's Vallejo's cover. And like I said, I think Taurus's cover captures the vibe of the story the best. I like Frazetta's cover next, just because it's got a great monster design. I know you can't see it on my camera, but it's got a really cool design for the titular monster men. And Vallejo's is probably my least favorite, just because it shows... That's a cover that you could put on any adventure story. It doesn't really capture the vibe of the story in my mind. So, yeah, I'm happy I managed to get this edition, just because I really like the cover art the best of the editions that were made for this Ace edition. But obviously this Ace edition came out several decades later. But the first book version of the Monster Men was first published in 1929. And that's kind of significant because that was 16 years after the original A Man Without a Soul had been published. And that's kind of interesting because normally Burroughs was pretty on the ball with publishing his stories. Like when the Tarzan and John Carter series were popular, he got those published relatively quickly, within, I think it was usually like 5 to 6 years. But Man Without a Soul took a long time to get to book publication, and in fact, some of Burroughs' other speculative fiction that were sort of one-off stories, like Beyond 30 and Moon Maid, actually got books first before this one did. And I know I said Moon Maid is one-off. It's technically 3 separate stories, but they're usually combined into one cohesive tale. So those stories actually were released to book form before this one was. And there might be a reason for that I'll bring up later on. And this is also a story that I was kind of interested in because this was one of Burroughs' one-off stories. It wasn't connected to any series. There wasn't really any sequels that he did regarding this. Later authors did write sequels to this, I learned, but Burroughs himself did not. And yeah, that was kind of interesting to me, just because I was kind of curious about what this story was like and how it would work as a one-off experience. Because I think one-off tales are very interesting, especially in the sense of you don't have to worry about a larger narrative that might go on through other stories. You have just this one focused tale. So I was definitely interested in that. I was also kind of interested because on the Edgar Rice Burroughs groups I frequented, like For the Love of All Things Edgar Rice Burroughs on Facebook, this story has kind of a mixed reception. I've heard some people say it's one of Edgar Rice Burroughs' most underrated works, and you need to read it, and it's great. And I've heard other people say, yeah, this one isn't all that good. It's kind of meh. And a very split reaction I've seen to this story. So I was really interested in checking this out just to see how I would feel about it. And as to how I got my copy, this came from Dale McKellen's Edgar Rice Burroughs stash, which he gave me several months ago. Thank you, Dale. Like I said, I really like the cover, and yeah, this is a very cool edition. So, thank you, Dale. So, what is the story of the Monster Men? Well, the story deals with Professor Arthur Maxon, and Professor Maxon is a professor from Cornell University, and he specializes in biology. And one day, after a lot of experiments that he was doing privately, he ends up discovering a chemical process that can create human life. Unfortunately, when he creates it, the life only, the human-esque being that is made, only lives for a couple of seconds before expiring. And Professor Maxon realizes that if he wants to keep doing this work, he has to find somewhere else to do it, because he does not want to deal with getting rid of all these bodies that he ends up making. And he's also worried that the police are going to be asking some questions about, why are all these weird, what are all these weird things you're making, Professor Maxon? Especially, if someone discovers him, it'll look like he's a crazed murderer rather than someone who's been able to invent life. So he decides, all right, I need to find somewhere I can do my experiments in privacy, essentially beyond anyone's jurisdiction, because he kind of knows this could end up in a hairy situation legally. And so he takes his daughter, named Virginia, and he moves to the East Indies, and he moves to the small island off the coast of Borneo. And along with Virginia, he brings a cook, a Chinese cook named Sing Lee. And he also recruits this former American Navy officer named Carl von Horn, who apparently has some doctorate experience. And with Dr. von Horn, he starts continuing his experiments. All while keeping it secret from Virginia and the other servants on the island, for obvious reasons. But the experiments go on, and for the most part, most of the experiments are just like ugly and hideous, and not much mindfulness to them. But eventually, number 13 is created. He's a perfect specimen that's born from the process. And you'd think that Professor Maxon and Von Horn would be happy about this great achievement, but they don't really get a chance to celebrate it, because right as this happens, pirates attack the island. And they swipe this treasure chest from the professor that supposedly has a huge fortune, and they also kidnap Virginia. Now, number 13 has fallen in love with Virginia, and so he sets off after the pirates, as well as bringing a good chunk of the Monster Men with him, because the Monster Men have limited cognition, and basically the story says if you're tough enough and you're impressive enough, they'll follow your directions. And so he and the Monster Men set off after Virginia, while the professor and Von Horn, who is actually secretly in league with some of the pirates and wants Virginia for himself, also give chase. So it's this scenario where different parties are chasing different people. So that's the essential setup for the story. So I wanted to talk about what worked with the Monster Men first. And I would say that I really enjoyed the first half of this story because it's actually a pretty strong example of science fiction horror. Because, like, the first scene is showing the professor disposing of his created being at his house near Cornell University. And it's a very creepy scene, and you can kind of see Professor Maxon's deepening insanity. And I think his insanity is a good part of that first half because you see him going more and more deeper into these experiments, basically starting to visualize himself as God, or a god in a sense. And it just gets more and more disturbing as you kind of start wondering, all these servants in Virginia are stuck on an island with a guy who's making monsters. And it gets even more disconcerting when Professor Maxon reveals, I love my daughter. She's the jewel in my eye. She needs the best man possible to be her lover. I'm going to make one for her. And basically he wants Virginia to mate with one of his creations. This is so disconcerting that even Dr. Von Horn is kind of like, what? It's really disconcerting and disturbing. And I just kind of like the idea of a horror story about people being trapped on a small island where there's really no easy means of escape, and it's crawling with not just monsters, but also bloodthirsty pirates. Like, that's just a good scenario for a decent horror story. And there's actually this really good set piece, I would say around halfway through the tale, where this storm hits the island, because you always got to have a storm. And both the pirates and the monster men are loose, and things get very hairy very fast. So from I really like the science fiction angle and the horror angle of that first half. I think it's very, very well done by Burroughs. I also kind of like Dr. Von Horn in this because he's actually kind of an interesting antagonist. Because he is acting selfishly. He wants Virginia for himself. He tries to poison the well with number 13 when he notices number 13 is starting to grow fond of Virginia. But there are kind of these interesting points where you sort of see the deeper element of his character. Like, there are times where, yeah, he selfishly wants Virginia, but the story kind of portrays it as him having some legitimate concerns for Virginia, stuff that, if he didn't really care, he wouldn't really care about. Like when Professor Maxon says, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna have Virginia mate with one of my monstrous creations," he kind of goes. Von Horn just goes, "What?" Like, and it's not a thing of like he's just like grossed out by the idea because he's grossed out by the monsters. It's more the thing of like he's kind of going, how can you do that to Virginia? Like, it's kind of an interesting thing where he does have a certain amount of honor to him. Like, at one point in the story, they do point out that for all of his villainous tendencies, he is brave. So it's not a thing where Von Horn is just this mustache twirling villain. He does have a certain amount of moral fortitude, albeit not much. And it's kind of interesting seeing as the chase goes on and number 13 keeps mucking up his plans, he starts to get more villainous as he tries to catch Virginia and the professor's treasure. So that's kind of an interesting element with Von Horn. I also like that number 13 has this good inner conflict, because basically Von Horn is poisoned his thoughts saying, oh, you're not really a real person, number 13. You don't have a soul. Virginia really can't love you. And number 13 has this whole inner conflict throughout, I would say, most of the book, where he's wondering if he, as an artificial person, really can truly love Virginia in the way a real man could. And that's kind of his main inner conflict throughout the story. And I also like that number 13 has kind of a complex relationship with Professor Maxon and Dr. Van Horn. Because Maxon, at one point, he looks at him as a father figure, and then other times he wants to destroy him because he sees him as an obstacle to getting Virginia, or he thinks that Professor Maxon is going to destroy him. And, Dr. Von Horn, number 13 sort of sees him as this noble teacher, but as time goes on, he kind of starts to realize, oh, this Von Horn guy isn't entirely on the level. So I like that the protagonist, number 13, kind of has that complex relationship with both of them. One thing I noticed about this story, now to be fair, I've only read 2 Burroughs stories all the way through, but I will say out of the 3 I've read, this is definitely probably the sleaziest of Burroughs' work. Supposedly it's not the sleaziest. I've heard people say this other series called The Mucker is way more sleazier, but there's a good amount of sleaze in this story. For instance, I mentioned Professor Maxon wants Virginia to mate with one of his creations. And it's kind of framed almost as like a incestuous relationship because Virginia came from Professor Maxon. Number 13 came from Professor Maxon. So it's kind of framed as almost like a brother-sister romance in a weird way. And Professor Maxon frames it as like, oh, it's me in both of them. So there's kind of a slight element of parental incest by proxy, if that makes any sense. It's very creepy and disturbing. And there's also this scene, I would say about 3/4 through the book, where the monster men are on Borneo, and they come across a group of orangutans. And some of the monster men go, well, we're so hideous, none of the humans will like us. Let's go mate with those apes. And you get this scene where some of the monster men are fighting the apes, and one of them is trying to do something not so good to a female orangutan. So it's pretty sleazy. It's much sleazier than I thought Burroughs was going to go. But again, it's sort of a sleaziness that I think works. I mentioned my last review about Zenith Rand that I like sleaze that sort of justifies itself. It's like sleaze that says, okay, we're being sleazy to point out how screwed up this situation is. And yeah, Professor Maxon wanting to do quasi-incest, that is pretty sleazy, and it shows the disintegration of his mind. And the monstermen wanting to mate with orangutans is definitely showing their alienation from normal human people. So, again, it's sleaze that justifies itself, which I think is the best way to do sleaze if you're going to do it. Going back to the characters, I actually really liked Virginia as a heroine, because she actually has a lot of moments where she does do some very impressive acts. Like at one point, very early in the story, she actually fights off these pirates with a machine gun. She actually has a machine gun that she uses to fight off some pirates. And at one point, when she's captured on a pirate's boat, she very sneakily works her way to the edge before jumping off the boat in crocodile-infested waters, mind you. So this is she is very brave in this tale, and that's a lot of fun. But I also like that she has kind of this interesting dilemma where she loves number 13 because she doesn't know his origin. She doesn't know he's one of her father's experiments. She just thinks he's some handsome guy who ended up on the island and who she sees trying to rescue her. And he also goes by the name Bulan at one point, and he starts getting called that about halfway through the story. But because of this, she doesn't know where he's from. Number 13 doesn't want to tell her where he's from because he's naturally kind of unsure about how she's going to take him being a lab experiment. So again, you do see sort of the tragedy of this setup where Virginia is falling in love with number 13, but number 13 kind of has some self-worth issues and doesn't want to admit his origin. And so that I think is a good character conflict, because you want them to be happy, but you see this conflict where something is in their way. And so I really enjoyed that element of the love story. There's also a character in here named Sing Lee, who is the island cook, and he obviously have a name like Sing Lee. He is Chinese. I actually think he's a very cool character, because even though Burroughs does write him with a stereotypical Chinese accent, he's actually arguably probably the most effective character in the story, because a lot of times he's kind of the hero at several points, because he protects Virginia at several moments. He helps out Bulan once he becomes aware about what's going on with Bulan. And he actually ends up saving the day at the end with this important plot reveal. He was privy to something the rest of the characters were not, and this is actually what ends up sort of saving the day. And there's actually a lot of scenes where many of the characters don't understand each other's languages, but Sing Lee understands a lot of them, and he just kind of stands back and listens. But he doesn't act. He stands back and listens, and then he kind of waits for the right time to catch many of these characters during their duplicitous dealings. So he's actually very effective as a character. I also think there's a lot of good action scenes in this story. I mentioned the machine gun fight with Virginia, but there's lots of jungle fights with both pirates as well as orangutans. I mentioned that. There's also some, because it's a pirate ship, you gotta have people hopping on boats to do sword fights with pirates. And they're pretty exciting. I think they work really well. There's also, towards the end, there's a very good reveal about the professor's treasure chest, because the pirates stole the treasure chest, and Von Horn is really trying to get that, because supposedly it has the professor's wealth in it. And in the final chapter, there's a reveal about what is in the treasure chest. I won't say what it is, but it's a very good reveal, and I think it really kind of sums a lot of the story's ideas up just through that reveal. Kind of interesting that Burroughs had this obsession with treasure chests. Like there was one in Tarzan of the Apes that had a very big significance to the plot, and so does this one. So I'm kind of like, huh. It seems treasure chests were a theme in Burroughs' early career, so that's kind of interesting. So now I'm going to talk about what I think didn't work for this story. And this is kind of an interesting case because I mentioned I really liked the first half when everything's being set up on the island, the pirates are circling, the monster men are being created, and then a storm happens. All that stuff in the first half, I'm like, okay, this is a solid sci-fi horror. There's a good concept with the monsters. You got the threat of the pirates. You got a storm. I'm like, okay, this is building up to be a pretty solid science fiction horror. But unfortunately, the second half I think loses a lot of the power of the first half because the second half is essentially where the chase starts when Number 13 and the pirates and the professor and Von Horn run after Virginia. And the second half really switches the genre of the story. Like I said in the beginning of this video, it kind of turns into a jungle adventure story, which isn't necessarily bad, but the problem is that it was such a good, strong first half that felt very different from what Burroughs had done at this point in his career, that when we go to the second half, it feels like it's kind of Burroughs defaulting to, okay, I got to do a jungle adventure, so I'm going to do a jungle adventure. Because, he'd written Tarzan of the Apes, he'd written Return of Tarzan by this point, and so he has to go and do that. And that really kind of sucked a lot of the enjoyment factor I was having. I did not that I didn't enjoy the second half, but the second half feels like, okay, this is Burroughs doing what he's familiar with, whereas that first half felt like much more new and interesting, and felt like Burroughs actually experimenting and trying to do something with a genre that maybe he hadn't fixated on before, like science fiction, horror, particularly horror. So, and I think another thing that really bugs me is that second half, it has a lot of padding. Like, there's a lot of characters going one direction, missing one group of people, the people doubling back, this character going this way, this character going that way, this character backtracks, this one goes forward, then backtracks, then returns. It's like, there's a lot of wandering through the jungle, and it really does feel like padding in some places. Like, it feels like characters are just wandering around. And yeah, some of that you can justify by the plot, because there are some times where the characters are lost, but it's one thing for the characters to be lost in the plot. It's another thing for the reader to kind of feel like, okay, this isn't really going anywhere. This feels like it's chewing up a word count because we have to get it to a certain length. And like I said earlier, A Man Without a Soul was supposedly shorter than this final book version. And I really wonder if that second half in the jungle was the part where a word count was added, because something about that just kind of felt like, this sort of feels like Burroughs was adding stuff to make sure there was a certain word count. Like, something about that, a lot of parts in this second half just sort of feel like they're there because we have to reach a certain word limit. Again, any Burroughs scholars in the comments, please let me know if it was that second half where a lot of stuff was added, because the first half feels pretty cohesive to me. Like, I'd be surprised if the first half is where a lot of it was added, but yeah, that second half's padding just doesn't. It really sucks a lot of the energy of the story out. I also kind of dislike the main pirate. The main pirate is this guy named Muda Safir, and he's the pirate leader, and he's pretty bland as a villain. He doesn't get much time to shine. There's a bunch of other pirates who are kind of, backstabbing him because, they're pirates. They're going to backstab each other. But Muda Safir is just kind of there, and he's the main bad guy until he's not, and then he is again. Again, kind of that wandering element of the second half. So he's not really that interesting a villain. He's just generic pirate leader who wants the girl because pirate leaders need girls. But and he's really only there to initiate the second half of the story where everybody goes to Borneo. He just leaves no impression. And it just kind of feels like, oh, okay, we need a pirate to get the second half of the story going. Here you go. So, yeah, not that interesting a villain. There's also a thing of the pirates, as well as these headhunter tribes. There's a bunch of like headhunter tribes in the Borneo section of the story, and they don't get a whole lot of characterization. They're just kind of there to be the cannon fodder for Bulan and the monster men to fight, and so it's just kind of like, yeah, they're just kind of there. It's like, okay, we need a villain. Pirates, headhunters. We'll leave it at that. Like, it's just, they don't really have as interesting characteristics, and I'm kind of comparing this in my mind to A Princess of Mars and Tarzan of the Apes, where the enemy tribes, the Barsoomians and the Princess of Mars and the cannibal tribe and Tarzan of the Apes, they had much more distinct identities. They kind of had these more interesting backgrounds and designs and characterizations. The headhunters and the pirates really don't. They're just kind of like what you would think of when you think of a pirate and a headhunter. So, again, I don't think they're as interesting antagonists or as memorable antagonists as those previous Burroughs stories. Another thing, I mentioned the padding that I feel like the second half has, but I think the other thing that really drags the second half down for me is that there is so much backstabbing and team switching in this story, from like Muda Safir to Dr. Von Horn to Bulan and the Monster Men, and the Headhunters have their own agenda as well. They're all switching teams and getting new plots as the story goes on, and it gets to the point that there's so many characters who are doing team switches and backstabbing other people that the second half kind of gets hard to follow at some points. Like, you have to make sure you know who's backstabbing who's doing what. It becomes weirdly complex. I was not confused because I read this mostly all together. So the various plotters and schemers were fairly fresh in my mind. But if you read this and you took like a couple days break and you came back to the story, you might forget who is working for who is backstabbing who. Like, it gets weirdly complicated for a story that's supposed to be a pretty general jungle rescue story in that second half. Like, you should not be Like, even Game of Thrones was not this complex with its backstabbing and political intrigues. Like, it's so weirdly complex, and I think it doesn't fully work because it just, again, it kind of ties into that padding thing. It kind of feels like it's just there to justify why the story goes longer. And it's just kind of like, man, I feel like this could have been much more straightforward and it would have been more engaging. I also, another beef I had with that second half is that a lot of the characters who had those like really interesting qualities I mentioned in the first part, a lot of them kind of lose that interesting quality because Professor Maxon, I mentioned now in that first half, he's going more and more crazy as he perfects his artificial men formula and he makes these monster men. He's getting crazier. He's going to mate his daughter with one of them. But this is a slight spoiler, but I need to say it to explain why this is an issue for me. Around the start of the second half of the story, he actually starts getting sane again. He's sort of snapping out of his insane delirium. And that, I think, kind of robs him of his most interesting quality. Like, we were seeing this mad scientist, like, getting deeper and more depraved into his experiments and thinking these really depraved and nasty plans. But then he kind of, like, just gives them up after something happens, after some of his creations attack him. And I just kind of go, I feel like a guy who's crazed enough to go and build his own private island to do unethical experiments, I feel like he's kind of gone beyond the pitch there for what he's willing to do. So doing that, I felt kind of robbed Professor Maxon of his most interesting character trait, which was his obsession with monster men. So I also think that Von Horn is more interesting in the first half, because like I said, I do like that he gets more villainous as the chase for Virginia goes on. But I don't know, something about it becomes a little tedious. Like, it stops going from like a reasonable villain progression to just he turns into Snidely Whiplash. Like, there's no decency about him that he somewhat had in that first half. And I just went, yeah, he's not as interesting in the second half as he was in that first half, where he had selfish desires, but he was somewhat justified in them based on the situation he was in. Or at least they were understandable. And this even applies to number 13 himself, because the ending, and some of it is that ending reveal I hinted at involving Sing Lee. There's a reveal about number 13's origins, and I don't want to spoil it, but the way he was created is not quite the way that was initially implied through Professor Maxon's experiments. So that's all I'm going to say, but his origin isn't quite what we're told it was. And I think it kind of ruins a lot of the nuance of the story, because one of the things that, like I said earlier, I really liked that number 13 kind of had this inner conflict about, can he love Virginia when he's not like a person, like a biological person? That was really interesting to me, but the reveal of his origin basically throws a wrench in that. It basically says, oh, all those contemplations really don't matter. And it kind of ruins all that nuance that the story was going for initially. It also kind of raised a plot hole, because one of the things that's mentioned about Boulon is that he's, due to the perfections of the chemical process, he's super strong and tough. But when this reveal is made, it kind of raises a question about, well, wait, how did that happen if this thing happened instead of what the professor and Von Horn thought happened with him? Like, that doesn't make that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense unless this happened or that happened, and like it just raised a bit of a plot hole in my mind. And the other problem is that the reveal, it's only foreshadowed once at the very beginning of the story, and it's foreshadowed at a moment that most people are going to overlook, and which you would definitely overlook because it only happens once at the very beginning of the story. And that, I think, is kind of a cheap reveal when you only give the reader one hint at the very beginning of the story, and with no others throughout the rest of the story. To me, that's not the sign of a good reveal. That's kind of the easy way out for doing a reveal. Say, oh, I revealed this one thing right at the beginning. Meanwhile, everything else does not hint at that reveal at any point in the story. So, yeah, that reveal was not, in my mind, written very well, and I think it kind of ruins a lot of Number 13's character. You'll notice one thing I haven't talked about throughout this story is the monster men themselves. And that's because the story commits a very cardinal sin, which is that the monster men honestly don't get all that much time to shine. They're a significant presence in the first half of the story, and they are there in the second half, but they're not nearly as prevalent. And they just don't get much to do other than act like monsters and help out Bulan when he starts commanding them. And, you know, we're told about how dangerous and how vicious they are, but they're actually dispatched pretty easily throughout the story. They don't have as great of powers as we're led to believe, which may be part of, which I suspect that might have been part of what Burroughs was trying to imply. Like, these are not perfect creations. They're not as stupendous as Professor Maxon thinks they are. But again, it's kind of weird to make a story filled with monster men who are supposed to be scary, but they're actually dispatched pretty easily. And there's only one moment where I think they really are effective, and it's this one scene where Number 13 gets into a fight with one of the monster men when that monster man has grabbed Virginia. So, yeah, the monster men just don't get much time to shine. They have like these interesting designs as Burroughs writes them, but the monster men themselves just don't get much to do other than act creepy, attack people, and take orders from Bulan. Like I said, there are flashes of interesting ideas with them, like when some of them like see these orangutans, they're like, oh, let's hang out with them. They're more appreciative of us. At least they think so. It turns out orangutans have standards too. But yeah, I just really didn't like that we have a story called The Monster Men, and the Monster Men just don't leave as much an impression as I think they should have. That to me was kind of a bummer. So the final ranking of the Monster Men. I rank on a 5-star system, 0 out of 5 being the worst, 5 out of 5 being the best. And this was a weird case where I was heavily struggling between two different scores. And that was a 2 out of 5 or 3 out of 5. And in my ranking verbiage, a 2 out of 5 story is a painfully average story. It's a story that is average in a way that is not entertaining. It's just dull. And it gets on my nerves, and I'm not all that happy to read it. And 3 out of 5 is a pleasantly average story. It's one where, yeah, the story is average, but it's not horribly average. You're entertained by it. You do enjoy reading it, even if it's probably not going to leave much of an impression on you. So I just struggled whether to give this a 2 or 3 out of 5 stars. Because like I said, that second half, I think, sucks a lot of the energy out of the story. It doesn't... It ruins a lot of elements of that first half for me. Like all the interesting character relationships that were built up in that first half, they kind of get nixed in the second half. And there's a lot of pacing problems in that second half, and I'm just kind of like... my initial gut instinct was like, give it a 2 out of 5 because it's not entertaining me nearly as much as I thought it would. But then I started thinking about it, and I go, okay, there's a lot of things about the second half I don't like, but is it actually poorly written and poorly done? Does it still entertain? And I thought about it for a while, and I said, you know what? The second half, as much as I don't care for it, it isn't poorly written. It is still engaging, even if I think it's a little overlong. And I was never bored with it. I never went, oh, geez, I have to finish reading these couple of chapters. Like, there's a book I'm going to be doing here in a week or two that I did feel like a chore to read, even though it wasn't horrible. But I never felt like The Monsterman was a chore to read, even during that second half with the parts I was not all that fond with. So I think in good conscience, I have to give this a 3 out of 5 stars, which is a pleasantly average book. Like I said, I think that second half is where a lot of the problems pop up. I think it loses a lot of those interesting character moments and the characters' journeys. I think it feels very padded in a lot of parts. And like I said, it very much feels like Edgar Rice Burroughs going back to his safe zone of like, okay, I'm doing this horror stuff. Let me go to a jungle adventure. Like that part, I was like, okay, yeah, the second half feels very safe for what Burroughs was doing at this point in his career. But like I said, I think even though I'm not a fan of that second half, it is still entertaining. I think the book on a whole is still entertaining. And like I said, I think I really do like that first half. I do like the sci-fi horror angle Burroughs goes for there. And yeah, it's one that I think any Burroughs fan should read at least once. You may love it or hate it, or be like me and be kind of in the middle about it, but I think it is an interesting read. It is interesting to see Burroughs, at least for that first half, try to do something a little different compared to what he was doing at this point in his career. So, yeah, I would definitely recommend this to anybody who wants to see Edgar Rice Burroughs sort of do a horror story, or something maybe a little more of a sci-fi tale. Or if you like Frankenstein, but you think it should have been a little more action-filled. Yeah, that's who I'd recommend it for. And one thing that, going back to the beginning when I pointed out that the the Monster Men took over 15 years to finally become a book, but The Moon Maid and Beyond 30 did not. I think a big reason for that is that Beyond 30 and The Moon Maid were, from my readings, very close books to Burroughs' heart, because they were speaking to his political beliefs. Like Beyond 30 was supposedly a call against American isolationism during World War I, because Burroughs thought that Europe's destroying itself, America needs to step in, and he was writing very passionately against this idea of like, oh no, just stay out of it, keep things where they're at, that's their problem. And The Moon Maid, this was actually in a Pulpster article a while ago. The Moon Maid was kind of his reaction, supposedly against Bolshevism that had taken over Russia, or the Soviet Union, as it had become. So those stories had a bit more of a personal connection to Burroughs. He was sort of writing with a political undercurrent to those. And I have found nothing to say that The Monster Men was some sort of underlying political or personal statement by Burroughs. So my suspicion is that it probably took a while for Burroughs to get that into a book, or turn it into a book, probably because those other works probably just felt more personal to him, even though they came later. But they got books first before this one. So that's my suspicion. Any Burroughs fans in the comments, let me know if you share that suspicion, or if I'm got the wrong idea. So, yeah. Any inspiration? For those that don't know, I'm a working writer, and whenever I do these reviews, I like to talk about whether the stories I've read have inspired me to write a story in any way, if they've given me any ideas. And the first half definitely gave me some ideas for stories, because I just love the idea of a mad scientist making monsters on this isolated island. And especially they have this this very creepy sexual undertone of the scientists using the monsters for creepy sensual reasons, like how Professor Maxon wants to mate Virginia with one of his creations. I think that's an idea that has an interesting concept to it. I'm guessing there's probably an Italian horror or European horror film that probably does something like that in a way raunchier way. But yeah, that's kind of an interesting concept to me. I would say if I did it, I would probably do it with an island off the Florida coast between the Florida Keys and Cuba. Just because I like writing more regional works. So that would probably be, if I made that story, that would probably be my take on it. So that was my episode on The Monster Men. I really don't have much else to say because I've already said so much. Yeah, I'm looking at a timer. This video is about to hit the 1 hour mark. So, yeah, it was an interesting experience. I'm glad I read this book just to see what Burroughs was doing at this early junction in his career. So, yeah, thank you very much to anybody who stuck through the whole thing. I'm going to be trying to read The Gods of Mars and Return of Tarzan next. Then I was going to do The Cave Girl and the third John Carter story. I think that's Warlord of Mars. I don't quite remember, but I'll be getting to those soon, and also be doing the last few Rocket Summer and Jungle July stories here in the next few days. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you guys soon. Bye.